Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar on the Nebraska manufacturing industry. It's presented by the Bureau of Business Research, which is part of the College of Business Administration at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and also the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which is also part of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the director of the UNL Bureau of Business Research. With me is Michael Nagle with the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership. We're pleased to present this webinar to you today. Before we go ahead and get started, let me give you a few more details. We'll be presenting, Michael and I will be presenting this PowerPoint over the next 25 minutes or so. I'll be sharing a set of slides with you, and Michael will also be giving you some information about the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership midway through the webinar. Also at the end, Michael and I will both be available to answer any questions you have. You may have noted in the center middle of your screen is a window where you can type in those questions that you have. You can do so during the presentation while they're on the top of your mind, or you can wait till the end and type in a question then. We will be answering those questions at the end of the webinar presentation. I'll also call your attention to a few other things. You can kind of see who the other attendees of the webinar are there in the window on the center right part of your screen, and you can also chat with some of the other attendees of the webinar in the chat area at the bottom right part of the screen. You'll also find there a link to the Nebraska Manufacturing Report that the Bureau of Business Research had an opportunity to prepare thanks to the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership, who supported our research efforts, so we want to thank them for that. So in addition to the chat room, question and answer window, you'll also see that in the center top part of your screen that we'll be asking several survey questions or questions of the webinar attendees during the course of the webinar, just to get your opinion and answers on a few subjects, and then we'll see what the consensus of the group was and bring in some information from the webinar as well in those questions. So there'll be 3 survey questions during the course of the webinar, and you can see the first one there, although we're going to wait just a few minutes before we let you answer that question. So with that background information taken care of, why don't we go ahead and start presenting to you our webinar on the Nebraska manufacturing industry. Just to give you a quick outline of the topics we'll talk about. Briefly, we'll talk about the contributions of manufacturing to the Nebraska economy, economic conditions and resource prices which influence Nebraska manufacturing. Also as part of that, that's when we'll have our discussion of the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership. The third topic will be recent trends in Nebraska manufacturing, so we'll look at growth of the industry in terms of employment, in terms of value added over the last 10 years, and then lastly we'll look at some detail on the current structure of the Nebraska industry. What are our key types of manufacturing that our state specializes in? What is our do we have a lot of large, small, and mid-sized manufacturers? Issues such as that. So let me now proceed then to that first topic: contributions of manufacturing to the Nebraska economy. Now, while Nebraska is often considered an agricultural state, and for some good reason, it is a state, I think the 3rd-ranked state in the nation in terms of the share of the economy that's directly located in the agriculture industry, in farming and ranching. However, it's important to keep in mind that manufacturing also accounts for a large share of the Nebraska economy. We went ahead and measured that in 2 key ways: value added and employment. So 9.7% of Nebraska wage and salary jobs are in the manufacturing industry. In other words, about 1 in 10 Nebraska workers works in the manufacturing industry. That's a pretty big share of the employment opportunities. If you look at value added, which is the broadest measure of an industry's contribution to the economy, it's kind of analogous at the state level. Value added is analogous to that gross domestic product concept, GDP, that you might see talked about for the U.S. economy. How large is our economy? How large is our GDP? How fast is our GDP growing? Value added for the manufacturing industry is kind of a state equivalent of that same concept. And you can see in terms of value added, manufacturing in Nebraska accounts for nearly 13% of the value added our economy, or about 1/8 of the value added of our economy. So that's another indicator of manufacturing's importance to our state economy. And I think the fact that the share of value added is significantly higher than the share of employment also tells you about how productive workers are in the manufacturing industry, and that it's a relatively higher wage industry. Here's how we calculated those numbers for value added. You can see the total employment in Nebraska is just over 1 million jobs, and manufacturing accounted for 97,000 jobs. In terms of value added, the value added in the Nebraska economy is nearly $100 billion. Manufacturing accounted for almost $13 billion each year in terms of value added. Now, when you talk about the size of the economy or the impact of a certain industry, it's important to keep in mind that there's a direct impact and a multiplier impact. The direct impact is those people who directly work in an industry. And we already talked about that, 97,000 Nebraska employees working in our state's manufacturing industry. But there's also a multiplier impact that occurs. Why does that occur? Well, think about the suppliers to the manufacturing industry. Manufacturers purchase a lot of services, say from the construction sector, from professional business services, accountants and so forth. And when the manufacturing industry is doing its business, it creates opportunities in these other industries as well. So additional employment is supported. Just as importantly, if you think about those high-wage manufacturing jobs, as Nebraska's manufacturing employees are spending their paychecks on all the items households spend money on, health care, shelter, whether it's their mortgage or rent, retail items, dining out, going on vacation, all the things that we spend money on, that creates additional job opportunities throughout the Nebraska economy. So we wanted to count that multiplier impact from the manufacturing industry as well as the direct jobs. Now, before we go see those results of the total impact on the economy, including the multiplier impact, I want to make sure you've had a chance to see our first survey question. And that question is, what is the top country for Nebraska manufacturing exports? So what is the country that the most Nebraska manufactured goods are exported to? Is it the United Kingdom, China, Japan, or Canada? So if you haven't had a chance to go ahead and vote, please try to go ahead and give us your answer over the next 30 seconds or so. Okay, so back to the webinar. What was our findings? Okay, so if you looked at just the direct impact, we saw about 9.7% of Nebraskans are employed in manufacturing. This is actually larger than the typical state. If you look around the 50 states of the country, 9.7% is a higher share than most states. It's also higher than the national average. So in addition to being an agriculture state, Nebraska is also a bit of a manufacturing state, key part of our economy here. You especially see that if you think about the total economic impact of the manufacturing industry on the Nebraska economy. So not just that direct impact, direct employment in manufacturing businesses, but also the multiplier impact. You see about 1/4 of the Nebraska economy is either directly or through the multiplier impact the result of our state's manufacturing industry. Now I'd like to move on to the second part of our webinar, where we focus on the sort of underlying economic conditions in the global economy in terms of the relative cost of doing business in the United States and here in Nebraska, those underlying economic conditions and resource prices, and what those say about the prospects for Nebraska manufacturing. As part of that, we'll also talk a little bit about the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which is certainly a key resource for our state's manufacturing. The great thing is pretty soon here we'll have the answer to that first survey question. But before I get to that, Let's talk about exporting. So exporting is a big part of the Nebraska economy. And I think what's striking, even surprised me when I looked at some of these numbers over the last decade, is how quickly manufacturing exports are growing here in Nebraska. So between 2005 and 2015, there was a 128% increase in the value of Nebraska's manufactured exports. Now, there was some inflation during that period. The general price level rose about 21% cumulatively between 2005 and 2015. So if you adjust for that, you can still say, gee, about 100% real growth, a doubling of Nebraska exporting over the last 10 years. So that growing export market is critical for our state's manufacturing sector. What are the top export markets for manufactured goods? Well, China and Japan are up there, number 3 and number 4, but the two largest export markets are our neighboring countries, Canada and Mexico. Those are number 1 and number 2, followed by Japan. Historically the largest economy in Asia. I think it's been surpassed by China now, and then of course China 4th. So those of you who said Canada, you were correct, and those of you who said China, you were close to correct, because that is one of our top 4 trading partners. But the importance of our neighboring countries really shines through there. And this is just a chart showing the progress and the value of our manufacturing exports. It doesn't go up every year, but goes up most years, and since 2005 we've certainly had quite a bit of growth. We're ready now to talk about poll questions 2. So during the Great Recession that occurred from 1997 to 2009, where were the, we seem to have question 3 there, forgive me. Let me get to that question in a little bit. Let's focus on poll question 2. Are manufacturing wages in the United States higher or lower than in our leading competitor nations? Are they generally higher, generally lower, or about the same? So why don't we, I'll give you a few minutes to answer that question while we proceed with the webinar. I want to talk a little bit more about these underlying economic conditions and resource prices. So we talked about the growth in exporting over the last decade. What about some of the key commodities, the key resources, and key resources that impact the Nebraska economy? Well, obviously some of the key commodities for the Nebraska economy are agricultural outputs, farming and ranching outputs, crop and livestock. And so it certainly is true that crop and livestock prices have a big impact on the Nebraska manufacturing industry. A lot of Nebraska's a significant chunk of Nebraska's manufacturing industry is involved in manufacturing inputs to agriculture, combines, irrigation equipment, all sorts of other equipment that farms and ranches use. So obviously when crop prices are strong, when livestock prices are strong, that's beneficial for producers in terms of their profits and income, and therefore you tend to see some benefits for Nebraska manufacturing as well. But it's not entirely a positive thing when those prices are high. After all, if say beef prices become very high, that can lead to a little bit of a reduction in consumption if you think about consumers. So I think you can say crop and livestock prices have a positive but somewhat mixed impact on Nebraska manufacturing. Over the last decade, they've also been a mixed bag. They rose very rapidly during the last decade, but then they've fallen in recent years, and that decline has placed some pressure on the part of our manufacturing sector, especially the part related to producing farm implements and other inputs into manufacturing. 2 other key prices that we tracked over the last decade were the price of energy, in particular electricity, and the price and the wages in our state's manufacturing industry. So let's see some results for electricity in particular, a big part of our energy sector. What you can see here is that Nebraska has an advantage over the rest of the United States in terms of electricity prices. Generally speaking, the United States has lower energy prices than many other parts of the world. And within the United States, Nebraska has lower energy prices than the rest of the country, and most states, and certainly the national average. Now, you will notice if you look at this period from 2006 to 2014, it seems like the gap between Nebraska and the rest of the U.S., the size of our advantage, has declined a little bit during that period. Like many parts of the country, Nebraska has been adding more capacity and alternative energy. There's a variety of issues there and benefits and costs to consider. I think one consequence of that has been a little bit of a relative increase in our electricity prices. Okay, now let's look at the issue of wage rates, and this will allow us to give you some results pertinent to the second poll question. Now this chart admittedly is a little bit complicated, but it looks at the trend in manufacturing wages in a series of countries between the mid-1990s and 2012. And the graph really presents wages relative to the U.S. You can see the U.S. is represented by that horizontal line, that straight line. So, and then the wage rates in the other countries are all relative to the wage rate in the U.S. So, for example, in 1996, the wages in Germany were, manufacturing wages were generally about 20% higher than they were in the U.S. Versus other countries where the wages were a little lower than the U.S. I think what's clear from this graph is since the beginning or mid part of the 2000s that the relative wages in the U.S. have improved or become more competitive. So say 2001, 2002, all the other countries had lower wages relative to the U.S., but by now both Germany and Canada have surpassed us and now have higher wages. Countries such as Denmark and Japan have started to catch up with us in terms of the wages. Even some of the developing countries we had data for, like Argentina and Brazil. Obviously, wages are still lower in those countries, but the gap has started to close with the U.S. This is obviously a mixed bag. There's a lot of advantages to higher wages, but in terms of our international competitiveness, wages are still a big part of the cost of doing business, even in manufacturing. We've become more internationally competitive. So what does that say in terms of responses? In terms of the poll question 2, about 3/4 of you indicated that wages are generally higher in the U.S., with the rest split between generally lower or about the same. I'd say if you look at some of our key competitors in the developed world, our wages are about the same. We have somewhat lower wages than Germany and Canada, somewhat higher wages from the 2 other developed countries you see in this graph. But it is true compared to the whole global economy in terms of, including developing countries, we do have higher wages than in those developing countries. Although the gap, again, appears to be closing. I'm going to go ahead and let Michael now talk about the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership.
Okay, thank you. The Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership is housed on East Campus Agricultural Hall. We've been doing it about 2.5 years. Our mission is to go out to help small to medium-sized manufacturing companies, help them be more competitive, more cost-effective, and more sustainable in the marketplace. So we've got a team of project managers that take care of the state of Nebraska. We also have the access to University of Nebraska. If there's any special skill sets that we can't provide internally, we can call upon specialized engineering groups to help for that support. One of the other big advantages being an agricultural-based state is we do have close ties with food processing center. So a lot of our projects are actually more involved in food safety. That's becoming more of a bigger issue for consumers, for crop production opportunities. So that's one of the big tie-ins with Innovation Campus that I know as a state we're going to try to showcase that more, because there's some great possibilities and just state-of-the-art facilities. From our group, we look at continuous improvement, working with manufacturers for cost-saving ideas, for lean opportunities, to be able to increase their productivity. We're also looking at marketing and growth. What can we do to help them grow their business? you'd mentioned with exports have grown almost 100%. That's one of the aspects with manufacturing is we need to think more in terms of a global perspective, not just what we can sell in Nebraska or in the Midwest. So that's one of the factors that we're trying to help manufacturing companies look at a bigger picture than just what they've been selling in their existing customer base too. Quality management, one of the things we can help out with is ISO, or quality management, quality products. You need to be able to provide a quality product not only domestically, but if you are selling internationally. ISO is one of the international standards that most companies comply with to be able to sell, for example, to Europe. And then for sustainability, we're working with that, the environment, doing energy audits. Those are going to become more and more important in the next few years, simply because the cost for energy are going to continue to rise. Even though from an electricity perspective we are one of the cheaper states, but there's no sense of having excess waste. You need to document that and be able to fine tune and fix your problems, because that's just cost going out the window, so to speak. And then with workforce development, the past couple of weeks I've had a chance to visit several manufacturers, a couple of different working groups. One of the things that I'm really impressed with is the collaboration between small communities, counties. They're trying to take a concentrated effort to be able to attract and retain workers in the communities. They're looking at getting high school students a little more involved. Manufacturing Days coming up October 7th. Some communities are trying to work with their high school students to be able to have a manufacturing company showcase what do they do, what opportunities they may have. And so I think there's some great opportunities in Nebraska in manufacturing going forward.
Exactly, and I think some of these services offered by the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partner, that's a great way to finish up our section on some of the advantages that Nebraska manufacturers have. I should also mention, I think the Nebraska Department of Economic Development and the Nebraska Department of Labor also have been working on some of these skills gap issues in manufacturing and other industries. Okay, let me go ahead and then proceed with the last sections of our webinar. Before I do that, now I'm ready to go ahead and give you the poll question number 3. And that is, during the Great Recession, again, that severe recession from 2007 to 2009, at least those are the official dates for the recession. I know some people have felt it's lingered on longer than that. During the Great Recession, were job losses more severe in what's called the durable goods manufacturing industry? That's goods that are meant to last 3 years or more, so obviously machinery, those agricultural implements we talked about, or machinery that's used in agriculture, transportation equipment. We make a lot of car parts here in Nebraska, and obviously some of the implements made for agriculture are also transportation equipment in terms of tractors and combines and so forth. Was it that part of the sector, manufacturing, that was hard hit with job losses, or was it non-durable goods? That's largely food processing here in Nebraska, but also pharmaceuticals and chemicals are a leading industry there. So where do you think the job losses were most severe? That's our poll question number 3. Now, before we get to that, let's go ahead and talk about what some of the trends in manufacturing have been over the last decade. I see at least 2 or 3 key trends here. First of all, despite the Great Recession, and that sure did hit the manufacturing sector hard around the country, and including here in Nebraska, despite that, manufacturing continues to thrive in Nebraska. So if you look at the amount produced in well, you sure saw those export numbers earlier, and if you just look at the total production, value of production of Nebraska manufacturing businesses, if you look at value added, that GDP type concept for Nebraska manufacturing, all of those things have grown during the 2005 to 2015 period. So the industry continues to expand and thrive. That said, there have been job losses in the industry over that period. One of the reasons Nebraska manufacturers are able to export, able to compete around the world, is because manufacturing facilities are extremely productive and productivity just seems to grow and grow faster and faster year after year. So that efficiency allows manufacturers to compete, but what it also means is that during some periods, despite the growth in sales and value added, employment actually declines somewhat. You've seen that at least during periods of the 2005 to 2015 period. Okay, let's look at some specific graphs showing these results. So these are trends in manufacturing employment in Nebraska. What you can see is employment is down about 5,000 or 6,000 jobs between 2005 and 2015. There was a big drop. About 12,000 jobs were lost during the Great Recession, or right after the Great Recession. But then employment started to grow again in the state, sort of a rebound. We were able to get some of those lost jobs back as the manufacturing sector started to expand again. Have had a little dip in recent years. I think that's related, last year, that's related to some of those losses in farm machinery as farm profits have fallen from their peak levels. But you can see, at least during a period of normal economic expansion when prices are fairly stable, you will get job growth in manufacturing. Unfortunately, what typically happens is there's severe job loss during recessions in manufacturing, and the long-term trend seems to be stable or somewhat of a decline in manufacturing employment. To answer our poll question, this shows where the job losses were, durable and non-durable goods. As you can see there, the non-durable goods, food processing, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and other chemicals, that stayed fairly steady during the 5-year period, the 10-year period, but we had a big loss in durable goods manufacturing, especially during the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 2009. So that's where our job losses have been concentrated, and congratulations to the audience, you nailed it. About 5 out of 6 people had said durable goods manufacturing. I did talk about value added later, and this gives you a little bit more detail on that. You can see that focusing on the numbers on the scale on the right side of the graph, there was an increase in value added in manufacturing from 2005 to 2015. You can see that the total value added manufacturing did decline during the Great Recession. That shadowy area in the middle of the graph is the recession period. There was a decline in that period, but despite that, if you look at the overall 10-year period, there was a decent increase in manufacturing value added. So the industry continued to thrive despite the Great Recession. The Great Recession, however, did cause the share of the Nebraska economy in manufacturing to drop somewhat. I think we saw that around the country as well. Probably less so here in Nebraska, actually, than around the rest of the country.
That would be true.
The industry itself continued to grow. Okay, let's just briefly wrap up here with at least the webinar, the PowerPoint part of the webinar, with some facts about the structure of the Nebraska manufacturing industry. The 3 findings were there's a concentration of manufacturing jobs and more generally manufacturing production in food processing, the manufacturing of machinery, again used by farms, as households and also other manufacturing businesses, and fabricated metals. If you look at those 3, about half of our manufacturing employment is in those 3 sectors. Nebraska is lucky to have hundreds of small and mid-sized manufacturers, as well as about 24 very large manufacturers, so a good mix of small, mid-sized, and large establishments. And manufacturing is active throughout the state, so it's not one of these situations where most of the manufacturing is in a single city or just in the metro areas. It's pretty prominent in our rural, non-metro counties as well. Just a few numbers to back up those statements. You can see again, about just shy of 100,000 manufacturing jobs overall. About a third of those are in food processing. About a little more than a tenth of those are in machinery manufacturing, and about an 12th of those are in either fabricated metals or transportation equipment. Let's look a little bit at the size of Nebraska manufacturers as measured by employment. So there's nearly 1,800 Nebraska manufacturers that are employer establishments. They may not have employees at every moment, but sometimes they do have employees. And most of them, of course, have employees all the time. You can see about more than half of the establishments have between 0 and 9 employees um, at any given time. About a quarter have between 10 and 49 employees. So small employers, mid-sized employers are a big part of this industry. Um, Although I'll make one point. Because manufacturing is such a productive industry, because it uses so much capital, equipment, buildings in the production process, a manufacturer with 49 employees might be extremely productive and produce a large, a large value of output. So even those businesses can be quite substantial. About 5% are in the 50 to 99 or the 100 to 249 category, and again, just about 24 manufacturers with more than 1,000 employees. So a good mix of small and mid-sized businesses and also some large employers. And lastly, where's the manufacturing jobs located? You can see about a third of the jobs are in the Omaha metropolitan area, and about a sixth of the jobs are in the Lincoln metropolitan area. Now you have to be a little careful with Sioux City because most of the Sioux City metropolitan area is located in Iowa, I think even a little bit in South Dakota.
Yes.
But overall, Sioux City metropolitan area has as much employment as Lincoln, and I think a fair amount of that actually is located in Nebraska. South Sioux City is home to several large meat processing plants, for example. So you can see the metropolitan areas do account for a significant share. And I'm sorry we don't have any figures for Grand Island. Obviously, in the last few years, that's become a metropolitan area, but we didn't have a long enough time series to include it in this graph. But it's definitely true that a lot of the manufacturing employment is also in non-metropolitan Nebraska. Okay, well, those are the key points we wanted to make, and we'd like now to answer some of the questions you have. Perhaps you entered some questions during the webinar PowerPoint presentation, or perhaps you'd like to ask a question now, and you can continue to do that as something occurs to you. I see we already have a first question, and that is there anything Nebraska could change to encourage more manufacturing companies to come to our state? Yeah, and in our report, and I think in this presentation, we've tried to focus on sort of the general economic conditions, trade, big issues, relative wages, things like that, and how that affects. We've sort of shied away from, well, what public policies could Nebraska pursue, but I think we've talked about a few of them. Obviously, the manufacturing extension efforts can be critical. The efforts to address some of the skills gaps, finding workers for manufacturing, is critical. I know that I've heard in some of the surveying we've been doing that there's manufacturing companies that say they could expand if they could find additional qualified and trained workers.
That is true. I did attend a summit sponsored by the state chamber about 3 weeks ago. Governor Ricketts was there. One of the things that he wanted to highlight was the importance of Nebraska manufacturing to the attendees and to the state. So within state government and Department of Economic Development, they are working on methods and methodology to help entice more companies to locate or expand in Nebraska. So that does have the attention of the governor, and he recognizes the importance of manufacturing.
Yeah, and how can we, I guess part of the answer is sort of keep up some of the things we've been doing and look for opportunities to expand those efforts.
And also with some of the county and collaboration efforts, I was at a meeting yesterday in York. One of the presentations was about how do you entice companies to come in. So one of the things that they're discussing is from a city, community effort, or county, how do you brand yourself to be able to offer incentives or make it a nice place that companies will want to go. It's a professional look, so there are some training efforts underway for that.
Okay, and then just more generally speaking, in terms of public policy, some things that would occur to me, as we talked about today, our manufacturing sector in Nebraska is, at least in part, closely linked with the agricultural sector. I'd say perhaps half the industry or so. So anything we could do to encourage the expansion of agriculture, I think, could also benefit manufacturing. So, the continued efforts of research and to try to help grow agriculture can be helpful. I think we do a good job in Nebraska in terms of irrigation policy, but things we could do to make that even more efficient and getting producers the water they need to expand production while, of course, protecting our rivers and natural resources. I think that could end up benefiting manufacturing as well. And lastly, I think efforts to improve the quality of life. Can we reduce the tax burden on the sort of middle class manufacturing working household? That could help make our state a little more attractive. Just things to keep in mind. No easy solutions there, but things to keep in mind. I see we have a second question. How do we compare to adjacent states? What have you seen in terms of some of the extension programs or other programs in the neighboring states that are available to manufacturers?
Well, I think we're fairly competitive in that regard. One of the things, being a native of Nebraska, it's one item that really stands out is our work ethic. Being from the Midwest and from the Nebraska, you do have a certain amount of work ethic that you can really shows up in the manufacturing sector and actually all jobs, all aspects of being Nebraska.
Absolutely. And now I would say I think that's a bit of a characteristic of the upper Midwest. So I think you'll see that to some extent in Iowa.
Well, I'm claiming it in Nebraska.
That's right.
That's right. From Nebraska.
That's right. Oh, absolutely. But I think Iowa, the Dakotas, I think you see some similar, at least labor market indicators that suggest very hardworking culture.
Yes.
In some of those states. But some of our neighboring states perhaps a little less so than here in Nebraska, for sure. In terms of other things, I obviously Colorado is a difficult state to compete with sort of we're thriving here in Nebraska in a lot of ways, but Denver is just growing very rapidly and has been for most of the last 2 or 3 decades. So sometimes it can be difficult to compete with Colorado. I think we do compete pretty competitively with Iowa. Particularly on the tax side, Iowa's a state tends to have a little bit higher tax burden than we have here in Nebraska. Kansas obviously has made some efforts lately in terms of their tax burden with some mixed results. I think it's fair to say. And Iowa, like Nebraska, and I think Kansas to some extent as well, does benefit from that link between agriculture and manufacturing. As well as South Dakota. South Dakota is a little tough, without an income tax, sometimes they can be a tough competitor as well.
That's true.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you for that question, Mr. Ray. Well, I think if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and let me again thank you for participating in the webinar, and thank the Nebraska Manufacturing Extension Partnership for conducting the webinar with us and sponsoring our research on the Nebraska Manufacturing Report. Should mention that our next webinar will discuss income inequality in Nebraska. So what are the trends and perhaps some of the causes of income inequality in Nebraska? I think that's another national trend that has impacted our state, but perhaps not quite as badly as some other parts of the country. Anyway, we'll talk about that on Friday, September 30th, again over the noon hour. And please follow us, connect with the Bureau of Business Research through social media. You see 3 ways to do that. Also, if you'd like to receive our newsletter, please send your preferred email to bbr@unl.edu. So thank you again for participating in our webinar. We hope to see you in September.